Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 4-year-old boy who was snatched from his front yard in 1984, while his mother looked away for just moments. A family terrorized for years by anonymous letters and calls from someone they called the Crow, a father who shot his own cousin in revenge, a mother accused of killing her own child, and a murder that remains unsolved 40 years later, tearing apart a family and haunting an entire nation. This is the story of little Gregory Villemin, France's most infamous unsolved case. Lapangis-sur-Vallon. It's a small village in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, population barely 900. In 1984, it was the kind of place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were impossible to keep and grudges could fester for lifetimes. Gregory Villemin was born on August 24, 1980. He was the only child of Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin, a young couple in their mid-20s who were building what appeared to be a successful life together. Jean-Marie worked as a foreman at a local car parts factory. It was a good job with decent pay and prospects for advancement. Christine worked in a textile factory. Together, they earned enough to buy a handsome house in Lapangis-sur-Vallon, what locals called a chateau, though it was really just a nice villa. They owned 2 cars. They had leather furniture. By the modest standards of their village and extended family, the young Villemins were doing well, perhaps too well. In September 1981, when Gregory was just 1 year old, the letters began. Anonymous letters written in crude, threatening language. Letters that expressed hatred toward Jean-Marie, that referenced his job as the boss, that promised vengeance for some unnamed offense. Letters accompanied by phone calls, a voice so agitated and distorted that listeners couldn't even tell if it was male or female. The letters contained detailed knowledge of the Villemin family's private lives. Information only someone close to them would know. Schedules, movements, relationships. The anonymous author wasn't a stranger. They were someone within the family's orbit, someone watching them closely. The media would later call this anonymous tormentor Le Corbeau, the Crow. The term came from a 1943 French film about poison pen letters in a small town. It was a part meant. The Crow's letters and calls were poison, slowly destroying the Villemin family's peace. For 3 years, the harassment continued. Jean-Marie and Christine tried to ignore it, tried to protect their young son from knowing about it. But the letters kept coming. The calls kept coming. "I hate you so much," one letter read. "The day you die, I will spit on your grave." The Villemins reported the harassment to police, but in a small rural community where everyone was related to everyone else, investigating proved difficult. Who could it be? A jealous relative? A coworker angry about Jean-Marie's promotion? Someone with a grudge no one understood? October 16, 1984, was a Tuesday, a normal autumn day. Christine was home with 4-year-old Gregory. He was playing in the sand pit in their front yard. Christine watched him through the window as she went about her housework. She looked away for just a few moments. Just moments. When she looked back, Gregory was gone. Christine Villemin immediately panicked. She ran outside calling for her son. She searched the yard, the road, anywhere a 4-year-old might have wandered. But Gregory was nowhere to be found. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Christine called the police to report Gregory missing. Around the same time, Jean-Marie's uncle Michel received a phone call. The voice was frantic, loud, barely comprehensible. But the words were clear enough. "I have taken the boy of the boss. I have thrown him into the Vallon." The Crow had made good on years of threats. Little Gregory had been kidnapped. A massive search was launched immediately. Police, firefighters, volunteers combed the village and surrounding countryside. Teams searched along the Vallon River, the waterway that wound through the valley. At approximately 9 p.m., about 4 hours after Gregory disappeared, searchers found him. His body was in the Valone River near the village of Docelles, about 7 kilometers from his home. He was fully clothed in his blue anorak. His hands and feet were bound with rope. His woolen hat had been pulled down over his face. Little Gregory had drowned. Whether he'd been alive when put in the water or already dead, the medical examiner couldn't definitively determine, but he'd been deliberately bound and placed in the river by someone who meant to kill him. The news devastated not just the Villemin family, but the entire region. A 4-year-old child, murdered. The village of Lapangee-sur-Valone was thrust into the national spotlight, and that spotlight would never fully leave. The next day, October 17th, another letter arrived at the Villemin home. "I hope you die of grief, boss. Your money will not bring your son back. This is my revenge." The Crow had done exactly what they'd threatened to do for 3 years. They'd taken Jean-Marie's greatest treasure and destroyed it. The investigation moved quickly, focusing on the extended Villemin family. The Crow's letters and calls indicated intimate knowledge of the family. The killer had to be someone close. Bernard Laroche was Jean-Marie's first cousin. They'd grown up together, had been close friends. Laroche lived nearby, had access to the family, knew their routines. On November 5th, 1984, just 3 weeks after Gregory's murder, Bernard Laroche was arrested. The evidence against him came from 2 sources. First, handwriting experts suggested Laroche's writing resembled that in some of the Crow's letters. Second, and more damning, Laroche's 15-year-old sister-in-law, Muriel Ball, told police she'd witnessed Laroche taking Gregory away in his car on the afternoon of October 16th. Laroche denied everything. He insisted he'd been elsewhere that day, that he had nothing to do with Gregory's murder, that he'd never written the letters or made the threatening calls. But the evidence seemed solid. Handwriting analysis, though not an exact science, pointed to him. Muriel Ball had identified him as the kidnapper. Prosecutors felt confident they had their man. Then, just days after implicating her brother-in-law, Muriel Ball recanted. She claimed police had coerced her testimony, had pressured her as a vulnerable teenager to say what they wanted to hear. She said she'd lied. She hadn't seen Bernard Laroche with Gregory. She didn't know anything about the murder. The case against Laroche began to crumble. The handwriting analysis was deemed inconclusive. Without Muriel's testimony, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. On February 4th, 1985, a judge ordered Bernard Laroche released from custody. There was insufficient evidence to hold him or proceed to trial. Jean-Marie Villemin was in the courtroom that day. He watched his cousin walk free, the man he believed had murdered his son. In front of reporters and cameras, Jean-Marie made a public vow. "I will kill him." Police should have taken the threat seriously. They should have offered Laroche protection. They did neither. On March 29, 1985, Bernard Laroche was leaving work at a sawmill when Jean-Marie Villemin appeared. Jean-Marie shot his cousin multiple times, killing him in the factory parking lot in front of witnesses. Jean-Marie was arrested immediately. He was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison, serving 4 before his release. Bernard Laroche's widow successfully sued the French state for failing to protect her husband after Jean-Marie's public threats. But the damage was done. Laroche was dead, unable to defend himself, unable to prove his innocence or confess his guilt. And Gregory's murder remained unsolved. With Bernard Laroche dead and the investigation stalled, attention turned to an unthinkable possibility. Had Christine Villemin killed her own son? In March 1985, graphologists examining the Crow's letters identified Christine's handwriting in some of them. Cord identical to that used to bind Gregory's hands and feet was found in the basement of the Villemin home. More circumstantially, Christine had been seen at the post office on the day of Gregory's murder. What was she mailing? Some of the Crow's letters had been postmarked from that office. In July 1985, Christine Villemin was arrested and charged with murdering her son. The accusation was devastating. Not only had Christine lost her child, now she was accused of killing him. The media descended on her with savage intensity. Speculation about her guilt dominated French newspapers and television. The famous writer Marguerite Duras wrote an article for Liberation newspaper suggesting Christine had killed Gregory in a moment of maternal psychosis. Duras had no evidence, no expertise in psychology or criminology. But her celebrity gave weight to her baseless theories, helping to whip up public judgment against Christine. Christine was pregnant with twins at the time of her arrest. The stress of the accusation and the investigation caused her to launch a hunger strike. After 11 days, she collapsed and miscarried, losing one of the twins. The case against Christine was built largely on the graphology analysis and circumstantial evidence. But handwriting analysis is subjective and often unreliable. The cord found in the basement proved nothing. Many households have similar rope. Her presence at the post office on October 16th didn't prove she'd mailed anything incriminating. Most fundamentally, there was no plausible motive. Why would Christine murder her own son? The prosecutors couldn't explain it beyond vague theories about mental instability. In February 1993, after years of legal battles, a court issued a rare order forbidding Christine's prosecution. The evidence was insufficient. She was innocent, but the damage to her reputation was permanent. Many people continued to believe she'd killed Gregory despite the lack of evidence and the court's exoneration. The Gregory Villemin case didn't just destroy the lives of Jean-Marie and Christine. It tore apart an entire extended family and exposed the dark underbelly of a small rural community. The motivation for Gregory's murder, investigators believed, was jealousy. Jean-Marie had succeeded professionally while some of his relatives struggled. He'd built a nice house while they lived more modestly. He'd risen to a supervisory position, becoming the boss that the Crow's letters obsessively referenced. In the close, insular world of Lapangee-sur-Valognes, such success bred resentment. The Villemin and Laroche families, all interconnected through marriages and generations of living side by side, fractured into factions. Some believed Bernard Laroche had killed Gregory. Others insisted he'd been innocent, making Jean-Marie a murderer who'd killed the wrong man. Still, others believed Christine was guilty despite her exoneration. Jean-Marie's parents, Albert and Monique Villemin, had also received Crow letters over the years. They became embroiled in the investigation, suspected at various times of involvement or knowledge they weren't sharing. Jean-Marie's half-sister Jeanette Villemin was arrested in 2017 but later released without charge. Gregory's great-aunt and great-uncle, Jacqueline and Marcel Jacob, were arrested the same year based on new handwriting analysis suggesting Jacqueline had written some of the Crow letters. The Jacobs were elderly by then, in their 70s. They denied involvement. Their lawyers argued there was no scientific proof, that handwriting analysis alone wasn't sufficient to convict. They were eventually released as well. The case had a tragic coda. Jean-Michel Lambert, the investigating magistrate who'd initially handled the case in 1984, committed suicide in 2017. He'd been heavily criticized for his investigation, for the wrong turns and mistakes that had allowed the real killer to escape justice. The weight of that failure and the public condemnation that came with it apparently became too much to bear. Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin relocated to the Paris area to escape the village where their son had been murdered and their lives destroyed. They had 3 more sons but never forgot Gregory. They've spent 40 years fighting for justice, cooperating with periodic reinvestigations, hoping that someday, someone will finally be held accountable. The Gregory Villemin case has never been officially closed. It's been reopened multiple times as new forensic techniques became available. In 2000, DNA testing was conducted on stamps used on the Crow letters. The results were inconclusive. In 2008, more sophisticated DNA testing was attempted on the letters, the rope that bound Gregory, and other evidence. Again, inconclusive. In 2013, DNA testing on Gregory's clothing and shoes. Still inconclusive. The problem, investigators explained, was that the available DNA was contact DNA, trace amounts from touching items, rather than blood or other biological material that would provide definitive identification. Contact DNA can be ambiguous, contaminated, difficult to interpret with certainty. In 2017, the case was reopened yet again. This time, modern analysis techniques applied to the letters and recorded phone calls led investigators to believe the crow was actually two people, a man and a woman working together. This led to the arrests of Marcel and Jacqueline Jacob and Jeanette Villemin in June 2017. The theory was that they'd conspired with Bernard Laroche to terrorize Jean-Marie's family out of jealousy over his relative prosperity. But the evidence remained circumstantial. Handwriting analysis suggested Jacqueline might have written some letters. Voice analysis couldn't definitively identify anyone from the distorted phone recordings. Without physical evidence linking them to Gregory's actual murder, prosecutors couldn't proceed. All three were eventually released. The case once again went cold. In 2020, a new examining magistrate took over, bringing fresh perspective. He conducted a series of witness interviews, hoping that after so many years, people who'd been afraid to speak might now come forward. In March 2024, an appeals court ordered fresh DNA and voice analysis at the request of Jean-Marie and Christine, who have never stopped fighting. They believe modern technology, particularly advances in AI-assisted voice recognition and DNA genealogy, might finally identify their son's killer. As of late 2024, this new analysis is ongoing. The Villemins, now in their 60s, continue to hope. But 40 years is a long time. Many potential suspects are now dead. Evidence has degraded. Memories have faded. The Gregory Villemin case has become embedded in French national consciousness in ways similar to how JFK's assassination haunts America or Madeleine McCann's disappearance haunts Britain. It's been the subject of thousands of newspaper articles, dozens of books, multiple television documentaries, including a 2019 Netflix series. It's been analyzed in university research projects, debated endlessly in French media, discussed by every generation of French people who've lived through it. The case represents a perfect storm of tragedy. A child murdered, family destroyed, a justice system that failed spectacularly, accusing innocent people while the real killer escaped, a media that abandoned responsibility, promoting unfounded theories and destroying reputations, a small community torn apart by suspicion and accusation. The case also reveals darker truths about rural French life, the jealousies that fester in close communities, the way success can breed resentment, the long memories for slights real and imagined, the willingness of someone to murder a 4-year-old child as revenge for perceived injustice. Who killed little Gregory? After 40 years, we still don't know with certainty. Bernard Laroche remains the prime suspect for many, including some investigators and the Villemins' lawyers. But Laroche is dead, killed by Jean-Marie before he could be proven guilty or innocent. Was it the Jacobs, as some evidence suggests? Were they part of a conspiracy with Laroche? Or were they uninvolved, merely suspects in an investigation desperate for someone to blame? Was it someone else entirely, someone who's never been seriously investigated, who's lived 40 years knowing they got away with murder? The Crow letters stopped after Laroche's death in 1985, which some take as evidence he was the killer. But a final letter was reportedly received by Gregory's grandmother in summer 1985, suggesting either Laroche wasn't the Crow or he had accomplices who continued after his death. Gregory Villemin was 4 years old when he died, a little boy who loved to play, who had his whole life ahead of him, who was murdered for reasons he couldn't have understood, punished for his father's success in a crime that defies comprehension. His murder remains unsolved 40 years later. His parents have lived their entire adult lives seeking justice that's been denied. His killer or killers has never been definitively identified or held accountable. The case has destroyed multiple lives beyond Gregory's own. Bernard Laroche, shot dead by Jean-Marie. Christine Villemin, accused of killing her son and losing a twin to miscarriage from the stress. Jean-Michel Lambert, the magistrate who committed suicide. The extended family, fractured beyond repair. The village of Lapangee-sur-Valognes, forever associated with this tragedy. French prosecutors continue to work the case. The latest DNA and voice analysis may finally provide answers. Or it may be another dead end in a 40-year chain of disappointments. Gregory Villemin deserves justice. His parents deserve to know who killed their son before they die. France deserves resolution to a case that has haunted the national psyche for 4 decades. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Gregory's story. Remember the little boy whose life was stolen for reasons that make no sense. Thank you for listening tonight. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 21-month-old boy who disappeared from outside a Greek farmhouse one summer afternoon in 1991. A case that would span 3 decades, hundreds of reported sightings, excavations for buried remains, and a mother who never stopped searching. A mystery that remains unsolved. This is the story of Ben Needham, Kos. It's a Greek island in the Aegean Sea, part of the Dodecanese group of islands near the Turkish coast. In 1991, Kos was already a popular tourist destination, known for its beaches, ancient ruins, and warm Mediterranean climate. But it also had quieter areas, rural villages where Greeks lived traditional lives away from the tourist resorts. Ben Needham was born on October 29, 1989, in Sheffield, England. He was the son of Carrie Needham, then 19 years old. Ben's early life was typical of a toddler, filled with the discoveries and developments that come with those first years. In 1991, Carrie's parents, Eddie and Christine Needham, made a decision that would change their family's life forever. They decided to move to Kos. They'd purchased a farmhouse in the village of Iraklis, near Kos town, that needed extensive renovation. The plan was to turn it into a home they could live in, perhaps eventually a property they could rent to tourists. The move offered opportunities. A new life in the Greek sunshine, escape from the cold and rain of northern England, a fresh start. Carrie and Ben went with them. Carrie found work at a local hotel, using her wages to help support the family while her parents worked on renovating the farmhouse. It wasn't easy work, the renovation. The property needed substantial repairs. But Eddie and Christine were determined, and they had help from local workers. By July 1991, the family had been on Kos for several months. Ben was approaching his 2nd birthday. He was a blonde, blue-eyed toddler, energetic and curious as 21-month-old children are. He was beginning to talk, to run, to explore the world around him with the fearlessness of a child who doesn't yet understand danger. The farmhouse in Iraklis was isolated, surrounded by fields and rural land. There were few neighbors nearby. Building materials were scattered around the property. Renovation work was ongoing. It wasn't an ideal environment for a small child, but the family was managing. Wednesday, July 24, 1991, was a hot summer day on Kos. Carrie had to work at the hotel. Eddie and Christine were at the farmhouse, continuing their renovation work. Ben was left in their care, as he often was when Carrie was working. It was supposed to be a normal day. Carrie would work her shift. Eddie and Christine would watch Ben while also working on the house. The toddler would play in the yard, supervised by his grandparents. But that afternoon, in a span of minutes that no one can fully account for, Ben Needham disappeared. The exact timeline of Ben's disappearance has never been completely clear. What is known is that on the afternoon of July 24, 1991, Ben was playing outside the farmhouse while his grandparents were nearby, having lunch and working on renovations. Around 2:30 p.m., Eddie and Christine realized Ben wasn't where they'd last seen him. The farmhouse yard was small, enclosed. A 21-month-old couldn't have gone far. They called for him. They searched the immediate area. Ben was gone. At first, there was confusion more than panic. Perhaps Ben had wandered into the house. Perhaps he was hiding, playing a game. Perhaps Carrie's brother, who was also on Kos, had taken Ben for a ride on his moped without telling anyone. But as minutes became an hour, as the searches became more frantic, as it became clear that Ben hadn't just wandered into another room or wasn't with his uncle, the terrible reality set in. Ben had vanished. The Greek police were called. Officers arrived at the farmhouse and began an immediate search of the surrounding area. The fields, the nearby roads, any place a toddler might have walked to, they found nothing. No sign of Ben. No footprints leading away from the property. No witnesses who'd seen him wandering. Nothing. Carrie was contacted at work and rushed back to the farmhouse. She arrived to find police searching, her parents distraught, and her son simply gone. The hours that followed were a blur of activity and growing dread. More police arrived. Search dogs were brought in. Neighbors were questioned. Had anyone seen anything? Had anyone noticed a vehicle in the area? Had anyone heard a child crying? One piece of information did emerge. Witnesses reported seeing a white Suzuki vehicle parked near the farmhouse around the time Ben disappeared. 3 people had been in the vehicle, a woman in the back seat and 2 men in the front. But the vehicle had left before anyone thought to note the license plate or get a better description of the occupants. Was this significant? Had Ben been taken by someone in that vehicle? By nightfall on July 24, 1991, Ben Needham had been missing for hours. The Greek police were treating it as a possible abduction. A 21-month-old doesn't vanish without a trace unless someone has taken him. In the days immediately following Ben's disappearance, the search intensified. Greek police, aided by British authorities, conducted extensive searches of Kos. The island isn't large, only about 40 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide at its widest point. If Ben was still on Kos, surely he could be found. Search teams combed through fields, forests, and beaches. Divers searched the waters around the island. Helicopters surveyed from above. Every abandoned building, every cave, every location where a child might be hidden or might have wandered was checked. British and Greek media picked up the story. Ben's photo was circulated widely. His distinctive blonde hair and blue eyes made him easily recognizable. Appeals were made for anyone with information to come forward. 2 days after Ben disappeared, on July 26, 1991, witnesses at the local airport reported seeing a child matching Ben's description with a woman. The child appeared to be being taken off the island, but by the time police followed up, the woman and child were gone. If it had been Ben, the opportunity to recover him had been missed. This sighting, unconfirmed and never followed up successfully, would haunt the investigation for years. Had Ben been taken off Kos within 2 days of his disappearance? Was he on the Greek mainland? In Turkey, just a short distance across the Aegean? Somewhere else entirely? Carrie Needham was devastated. Her son had been taken, she was certain of it. And whoever had taken him had moved quickly to get him off the island before police could stop them. The theory that emerged in those early days was that Ben had been abducted for illegal adoption. In the 1990s, child trafficking for adoption existed, particularly in less developed parts of Europe. Greece had seen cases of children being sold to childless couples desperate for a baby. Ben's young age, his blonde hair and blue eyes, his Western European appearance, all made him potentially valuable in such a market. The theory was that someone had been watching the farmhouse, had seen an opportunity when Ben was unsupervised for a few minutes, and had grabbed him. If this theory was correct, Ben might be alive, raised by adoptive parents who may or may not know he'd been stolen. He could be anywhere in Europe or beyond, living under a different name, speaking a different language with no memory of his biological family. But proving this theory was impossible without evidence, without witnesses, without finding Ben himself. In the months and years following Ben's disappearance, over 300 reported sightings came in. Ben, or boys who looked like him, were spotted across Greece, on multiple islands and on the mainland. Some sightings came from Turkey, others from as far away as Germany and even Australia. Each sighting was investigated. Each one raised hopes in the Needham family that this might be Ben, that finally he'd be found. In December 1995, 4 years after Ben disappeared, a private investigator named Stratos Bakirtzis reported finding a blonde boy, about 6 years old, living with a Romani family in a camp near Salonika, Greece. The boy matched Ben's description. His age was right. He claimed he'd been given to the Romani family because his parents didn't want him. Police took the boy into custody and conducted DNA testing. The results were negative. The boy wasn't Ben. He had a birth certificate, a documented history. His father was in prison. The story was sad but legitimate. This pattern repeated throughout the 1990s and 2000s. A sighting would be reported. The family would hope. Investigators would follow up. DNA tests would be conducted. Each time, the result was the same: not Ben. In 1998, a holidaymaker saw a blonde boy playing on a beach in Rhodes. In 1999, a photograph taken in a Turkish village showed a blonde child who resembled age progression images of Ben. In 2003, Carrie traveled to Kos with Ben's uncle to follow up on new leads. Each false lead was emotionally devastating. The hope, the anticipation, the crushing disappointment when yet another DNA test came back negative. Some of the sightings were undoubtedly genuine mistakes. People who saw a blonde child and, having heard of Ben's case, reported it out of a sincere desire to help. Others may have been hoaxes, people seeking attention or money, but they all had to be investigated. The alternative, ignoring a lead that might actually be Ben, was unthinkable. As the years passed, the sightings became less frequent. Ben would have been growing up, changing. He wouldn't look like a toddler anymore. By the early 2000s, he'd be a teenager. By 2010, a young man. If he was still alive, if he'd been raised by someone else, would he even know he'd been taken? Would he have any memory of his first 21 months of life? The Needham family never gave up hope that Ben was alive somewhere. Carrie, now growing older, marked every birthday Ben missed, every Christmas without him. She kept his case in the public eye, giving interviews, maintaining a website dedicated to finding him. Then, in 2012, a new theory emerged that would change the entire direction of the investigation. In October 2012, 21 years after Ben disappeared, South Yorkshire Police, who were assisting Greek authorities with the case, received information from a new witness. This witness claimed to know what had really happened to Ben Needham. According to the witness, Ben hadn't been abducted at all. He'd been killed in an accident. On July 24, 1991, building work had been underway at and near the farmhouse in Iraklis. A man named Konstantinos Barkas had been operating a digger, an excavator used for moving earth and rubble. The witness claimed that Barkas had told him that Ben had been accidentally struck and killed by the digger, and that Barkas had then buried the child's body in the rubble he was moving. This theory was shocking and horrifying, but it had a certain terrible logic. It would explain why Ben had vanished so completely. It would explain why no witnesses had seen an abduction. It would explain why the hundreds of sightings had never led anywhere. If Ben had been accidentally killed and his body buried in construction rubble, he might never be found. Building materials from the farmhouse renovation had been scattered, dumped in various locations. Ben's remains could be anywhere. Konstantinos Barkas had died in 2015, before this theory emerged publicly. He couldn't be questioned. He couldn't confirm or deny the allegation. But the witness's information was specific enough that police took it seriously. In October 2012, a joint operation between South Yorkshire Police and Greek authorities began. They would excavate the area around the farmhouse, searching for Ben's remains. The excavation was extensive. Forensic archaeologists, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. The search focused on areas where rubble from the construction work had been dumped. Carrie Needham, told to prepare for the worst, traveled to Kos to be present during the excavation. After 21 years of believing her son was alive, being raised by someone else, she now had to confront the possibility that he died the day he disappeared. The search lasted weeks. Every piece of rubble was examined. Every area the radar indicated was excavated. The work was painstaking, emotional, watched by media from around the world. One item of particular interest was found: a small yellow dinky toy car, a brand of toy vehicles popular in the early 1990s. Ben had been playing with a toy car the day he disappeared. Could this be it? but no human remains were found. No bones, no clothing, no definitive evidence that Ben had been buried there. In September 2016, police returned to Kos for further excavations. New information had emerged, additional areas that might contain Ben's remains. The yellow dinky car found in 2012 had been tested. There were traces of blood on it. Could the blood be Ben's? DNA testing was conducted, comparing the blood to samples from Ben taken at birth during the routine heel prick test performed on all British newborns. In November 2018, the results came back. The blood on the toy car was not Ben's. This was both disappointing and confusing. The car had been found in an area connected to the construction site. It was the right type of toy, but the blood wasn't Ben's. Detective Inspector John Cousins, leading the British investigation, made a statement that received significant media attention. Despite not finding remains, he believed Ben had died in an accident near the farmhouse. The recovery of the toy car, its location, and the circumstances all pointed toward this conclusion in his professional opinion. But professional opinion isn't the same as proof. Without remains, without definitive evidence, Ben's disappearance remained officially unsolved. Carrie Needham refused to accept that her son was dead. She continued to believe he was alive, raised by someone else, perhaps unaware of his true identity. She pointed to the lack of remains as evidence that Ben hadn't died in an accident. The investigation continued at a lower intensity. Periodically, new leads emerged. In 2021, witness reports claimed an English-speaking child around Ben's age had been found about 600 miles from Kos around the time of his disappearance, taken in and raised by the woman who found him. In 2024, a Danish man came forward claiming to be Ben Needham. He said his grandparents had told him he'd been taken from Kos. He described memories of being hidden, of hearing someone shout "Ben" at him at a market years ago. DNA testing was arranged. Carrie Needham, now 51 years old, prepared once again for results that might finally answer the question of what happened to her son. But as of now, those results have not been made public. The pattern has repeated so many times before. A potential lead, DNA testing, negative results. Today, more than 33 years after Ben Needham disappeared, his case remains unsolved. He has never been found, alive or dead. No one has ever been arrested in connection with his disappearance. The truth of what happened on July 24, 1991, remains unknown. Several theories persist. The accident theory, supported by some investigators, suggests Ben was killed by the digger and his remains were scattered or buried in construction rubble. The lack of found remains doesn't disprove this theory. It simply means the remains haven't been located. The abduction theory, which Carrie Needham maintains, suggests Ben was taken for illegal adoption. If this is true, Ben could be alive today, 35 years old, possibly unaware of his true identity or vaguely aware that something about his childhood doesn't add up. Some investigators believe witnesses on Kos know more than they've said. The witness who claimed Barkas admitted to the accident has refused to speak to police again. Others connected to the construction site have been less than forthcoming. Cultural differences, language barriers, and the passage of time have all made it difficult to get complete cooperation. Carrie Needham has pleaded with authorities to return to Kos, to re-interview witnesses who lied or refused to talk properly, to speak with police officers involved in the original investigation. She believes answers exist on that island, that someone knows what really happened to Ben. The case has drawn comparisons to other missing child cases, particularly that of Madeleine McCann, who disappeared from Portugal in 2007. Both cases involved British toddlers vanishing while on holiday in southern Europe. Both generated massive media attention. Both remain unsolved. But Ben's case predated Madeleine's by 16 years, and the response to it was different. Technology was less advanced in 1991. Media coverage was less intense. The investigative resources available were more limited. Some have suggested that if Ben had disappeared in 2007 rather than 1991, the outcome might have been different. More immediate response, better forensic capabilities, greater international coordination. But speculation about what might have been doesn't help find Ben or answer what happened to him. Ben Needham would be 35 years old today if he's still alive. He'd be a grown man, perhaps with a family of his own, with a career and a life. Or he died at 21 months old. His life ended by accident or violence. His remains lost somewhere on or near coast. Carrie Needham is now in her 50s. She spent more than 3 decades searching for her son, keeping his case alive, refusing to give up hope. She's endured hundreds of false leads, multiple excavations, countless disappointments. She's been told to prepare for the worst, told her son is dead, told to accept that he'll never be found. But she continues to believe Ben is out there somewhere. That someday, someone will come forward with credible information. That the right DNA match will finally be made. That after 33 years, she'll be reunited with her son. The investigation remains open. South Yorkshire Police continue to review leads as they emerge. Greek authorities maintain their files on the case. Ben's photo, age progressed to show what he might look like today, is still circulated. If Ben Needham was abducted and raised by someone else, he would now be old enough to research his own origins. If he's ever felt that something doesn't add up about his childhood, if he's wondered about gaps in his early memories, if family stories have never quite made sense, that curiosity might lead him to search. DNA testing is simple now. If Ben is alive and submits his DNA to any genealogy database, it could match with family members. The technology that has solved other cold cases could solve his. If you have any information about Ben Needham's disappearance, you can contact South Yorkshire Police or Missing People UK. Even after 33 years, information could be crucial. Ben's family deserves answers. Carrie deserves to know what happened to her son. Ben deserves to be found, whether that means finding him alive or finally locating his remains so he can be properly laid to rest. Good evening and welcome once again to this quiet space where real stories from the past find their moment to be told with calm. Tonight we're going to talk about a case that shocked Spanish high society in August 1980, the murder of the Marquesas of Urquio, a crime that revealed dark secrets behind elegant doors. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to share in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. Write your city, your country, what time it is for you. It's beautiful to know that in different places around the world, someone else is seeking these stories to rest. If you enjoy this content, narrated softly to help you relax, consider subscribing to the channel. Turn on notifications. And if you know someone else who seeks quiet stories, share this video. A like helps us greatly to reach more people who need this space of calm. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you to Madrid in 1980, to a mansion in the Salamanca district, where wealth and mystery met in a fatal way. The mansion on Lucana Street in Madrid's Salamanca district was imposing. Built at the beginning of the 20th century with a stone facade, tall windows, carved wooden doors. It was the type of building where Madrid's aristocracy lived. On the first floor lived the Marquesas of Urquio. Javier de Urquio, 74 years old, and his wife Maria de la Esperanza, 73. An elderly couple from one of Spain's most important families. The Urquio surname had history, power, money. They were bankers, aristocrats with connections in the highest circles of Spanish society. Javier was a serious man, educated, of the old school. He had dedicated his life to the family business, to maintaining the surname with dignity. Maria de la Esperanza was an elegant lady, discreet, who moved in the appropriate social circles. They lived quietly in their mansion, surrounded by art, antique furniture, a lifetime of privilege. They had employees who took care of the house. They received visits from family and friends of their same social level. But there was something else in that mansion, something very few knew. The Marquesas had a nephew, Rafael Escobedo, who had lived with them for years. Rafael was 28 years old. He was the son of Javier's sister who had died when Rafael was young. The Marquesas had taken him in as if he were their son. They had given him everything: education, home, money. But Rafael was not like his aunt and uncle. He was not serious, not hardworking. He was a young man who enjoyed the easy life, who spent money, who went out at night, who frequented places that his aunt and uncle would not approve of. The Marquises were worried about Rafael. They had talked with him several times about his behavior, about his future, but Rafael did not listen. And in the summer of 1980, that tension was about to explode. August 1st, 1980 was a hot Friday. Madrid in August was always hot. Many families had left on vacation to the coast, to the mountains. But the Marquises had stayed in Madrid. That afternoon, Javier and Maria de la Esperanza had been at home resting. The employees had already left. Only they and Rafael remained in the mansion. Around 9 in the evening, the Marquises had dinner, light as always. Then they retired to their bedroom. It was their routine. They went to bed early. Rafael was in his room on the upper floor. But that night, Rafael was not alone. There was someone else in the mansion. Someone who had entered without anyone seeing. What we do know is what happened next. Around 11 at night, someone entered the Marquises' bedroom. Javier and Maria de la Esperanza were sleeping, or perhaps reading before sleep. They were attacked brutally with a blunt object, probably a heavy candlestick or a fireplace poker. Both died there in their own bed. There was no struggle. There were no screams. They were surprised. Perhaps they didn't even fully wake before dying. It was quick, it was brutal, it was final. And after the crime, the killer or killers left. They closed the door, left the mansion in silence. And the night continued as if nothing had happened. The morning of Saturday, August 2nd, dawned sunny. The employees arrived at their usual time, around 9, to begin the day's tasks. They rang the bell. No one answered. That was strange. The Marquises were always awake at that hour. They used their key. They entered the house. Everything seemed normal, orderly, quiet. They called out, "Don Javier, Dona Esperanza." There was no response. They went up the stairs. They approached the bedroom. The door was closed. They knocked. Nothing. One of the employees opened the door, and what he saw left him paralyzed. The Marquises were in bed, motionless. There was blood on the sheets, on the walls. It was a terrible scene. The employee ran out. He shouted to the others, "Call the police. The masters are dead." The police arrived within minutes. The Salamanca district was an important area. These things didn't happen there, not to families like the Urquillos. The investigators examined the scene. 2 elderly people murdered in their bed, with blows to the head. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no signs of robbery. The jewels were there, the money was there. Nothing of material value was missing. This was not a robbery. It was something personal, something close. The investigators began to ask, who had access to the house? Who knew the Marquises' routine? Who would benefit from their deaths? And all the answers pointed in the same direction. Rafael Escobedo, the nephew. The police looked for Rafael immediately, but he was not at the mansion. He was nowhere they could find. They interrogated the employees. They all said the same thing. Rafael lived there. He had keys. He knew the house. There had been tension lately between him and his aunt and uncle. The Marquises, according to the employees, had talked about changing their will. They were worried about Rafael's behavior, about how he spent money, about his friendships. Rafael was going to inherit a considerable fortune when his aunt and uncle died. But if they changed the will, that would change everything. The police began to build the theory. Rafael knew that his aunt and uncle were considering disinheriting him, and he decided to act before it was too late. But there was a problem. They couldn't find Rafael. He had disappeared completely. They put his photo in all the newspapers, in all the police stations. They alerted airports, train stations, ports. But Rafael seemed to have vanished. Days passed. The media pressure was enormous. The Urquillos were an important family. This was national news. Everyone wanted to know who had killed the Marquises. And then, a week later, a call came to the police. A man who wouldn't give his name said he knew where Rafael was. The police followed the lead, and they found Rafael hidden in an apartment on the outskirts of Madrid. living with a friend who had helped him hide. They arrested him without resistance. Raphael knew he couldn't escape forever. At the police station, under interrogation, Raphael finally confessed. He said yes, that he had killed his aunt and uncle, but that he had not been alone, that he had had help. He mentioned an accomplice, but the details were always confusing. Some reports said it was a close friend, others that it was someone Raphael had hired. It was never completely clear. What was clear was that Rafael Escobedo, the nephew, the heir, had murdered the two people who had given him everything. Rafael Escobedo's trial began in 1981. It was a media trial. The newspapers covered every detail. Madrid's high society was shocked. How was it possible that a nephew would murder his own aunt and uncle? How could someone kill for money the people who had raised him? Rafael's defense tried to argue that he had had mental problems, that he had been under pressure, that he had not acted rationally. But the prosecution presented clear evidence. Rafael had planned the crime. He had waited for the moment when the employees were not there. He had acted with premeditation. And most damning, Rafael had confessed with details that only the killer could know. The jury found him guilty. Rafael Escobedo was sentenced to 30 years in prison for double murder. He served his sentence in various Spanish prisons. He was released on parole years later when he was already an older man. He tried to disappear from public life. He changed his identity, moved far from Madrid. The mansion on Lucana Street was sold by the family. No one wanted to live there after what had happened. The building changed owners several times. Today, it is a residential building divided into apartments. The Urquillo family never fully recovered from the tragedy. Not only had they lost two beloved members, they had also discovered that someone of their own blood was capable of something so terrible. The crime of the Marquesas of Urquillo reminds us that wealth does not protect from tragedy, that privilege does not guarantee security, that sometimes danger comes from where we least expect it. Javier and Maria de la Esperanza had lived long lives, full lives. They had raised their nephew Rafael as if he were their son. They had given him love, home, future, and he, out of greed, out of impatience, for reasons that perhaps even he himself did not fully understand, took their lives. Two people in their 70s murdered in their own bed, in their own home by someone they trusted. It is a story that makes us reflect on human nature, on greed, on how money can corrupt even the strongest family ties. Tonight we have remembered Javier de Urquillo and Maria de la Esperanza. Two long lives ended brutally by someone who should have protected them. If this story accompanied you tonight, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Share your city, your country, your local time. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories from the past. Give it a like if you enjoyed the content, and share it with someone seeking quiet stories for the night. Good night. May you rest in peace. May your dreams be peaceful. Sweet dreams. Until the next story.